the concept of the Torah that explains the Torah, the written Torah. It is a fundamental concept of Judaism that in order to understand Torah, the written Torah, you have to go and study the oral Torah, explains the written Torah. In the third Medrash Rabbi, in the Parshas Noah, it tells us that the Av is the generalization. That's the Tanakh, Rabbi Ksuvim, the and the prophets and the writings. And the Torah Shabbat Peh, that's the Mishnayos, the Gemara, Medrash, and all the Sifri, Sifron, Sefta, and all these are the Torah Shabbat Peh. They explain what it is. These are the generalization. These are the specifics of the generalization. Now, we cannot understand anything in the Torah Shabbat unless we look at the Torah Shabbat Peh. I ran across an article recently in the Jewish press in the week of January the 10th to January the 16th, 1986. And I want to start out the session with this, reading this article to you. The basic thrust of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah and the reasons that the Rabbonim, most of the Rabbonim argued with the Rambam when he set this up. And with your indulgence, I will read it to you. And then we will go on from there to other commentaries and see if we can understand something here. Very beautiful article. I found it.
Hindsight is a wonderful thing.
What?
Isn't it true that hindsight is a wonderful thing?
Yes, it certainly is.
So it's foresight.
No, there was a certain method here. The article was written by Rabbi Dr. Samuel A. Turk, Codes and Responsive. The oral law, which was, I'm quoting, the oral law which was given concurrently with the written Torah at Sinai, which was augmented through the use of the 13 hermeneutical principles, laws of interpretation. That's Rabbi Shmuel, that we read every day, by the Talmudic authorities, was transmitted orally for about 2,000 years. It was forbidden to put these oral laws and discussions concerning them in the academies into writing. It was a mitzvah allowed in the Torah that you're not supposed to write it down. You can find that in the Gemara and Gittin. At any rate, this vast and complicated material required difficult memorization and meticulous transmission for many centuries. This procedure of transmission baffled the human imagination, and one is amazed at the vast quantity of material which was successfully preserved. See, we're dealing with giants.
What did he say?
They use a lot of words.
Yeah, what is he saying?
He's saying that it was extraordinary accomplishment that the sages in those generations were able to maintain all this material by heart. Nowadays, Baruch Hashem, we have the Sforim in front of us and never. It's a pathetic thing.
I think they had some notes.
Well, it was considered an improper thing to write it down. It was, matter of fact, it was a negative thing. Could you bring me the Gemara, the Medrash Rabbi? The Medrash Rabbi. I understand. The Medrash Rabbi in Shmos. Mem Zayin, the Vilna Gaon quotes this in the beginning of Pirkei Avos, so you want to find out where you find it. At any rate, he says like this: all the Torah was given by God to Moses. That means the Torah, the written Torah and the oral Torah. And Moses asked God specifically, should I write it all down? Because God was giving him to transmit it to the Bnei Israel. And God told him no. And this is what the Medrash says. I've read this to you before, of course, just because it's something just repeating it just to refresh your memory. But obviously, and it says here, in Seder Kisiso and Mem Zayin, Parsha Mem Zayin, right in the beginning, you should write to you these words. Hudiksiv, and he's quoting Hosea Ches in the Medrash Rabbi, Akosav Lo, Roli Torah. If I write for him the majority of my Torah, Kamo Zar Nechoshvu will be considered like a stranger. The time that the Rebbeinu Shalom, the Holy One must be, revealed himself at Sinai to give the Torah to Israel, Al Seder, and he said to Moshe on this order, Mikra, that's the entire Tanakh, Mishnah, Talmud, Agoda, the whole everything. Shenemar, Shemos, Chop, and Daber Elohim as Ko Advarim Oela, all these words. Even what a student in the future will ask his teacher, Omar Kosh Baruch Hu Moshe Moshe Shah. God said to Moshe at that time, if there is a legitimate question that you have, a legitimate thing, God also explained that at that time. After you learn it from the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be He, Omer Lei, so God said, Lomdol Israel, teach it to Israel. Moshe said before him, Rabbeinu Shalom, master of the world, I read it all down for them. I don't wish to give it to them written. Why? It's revealed before me, the nations of the world, in the future they will have political dominion over the Jewish people. And will take it away from them. As happened. The king of Egypt, the scheme of his generation, 72 of the top scholars, put each one in a separate house under guard, and he asked them to go and translate the Torah of Moshe, your teacher. And they knew that this Goy would not understand that the Torah Shebaal Peh explained the Torah Sheb'Ksav. So they had to translate a little different some of the psukim in order that he shouldn't misinterpret to say there are more than one God. The translation usually in the beginning God created first the heavens and the earth. So they say Bereshit was also a God. Bereshit first created God, and then the two together got to there. So he had to say God created Bereshit. That's one of the changes they had to make. They had no communication between them, but God made a miracle happen. That all the changes they made, and all this Gemara and Megillah, not tests, and all the changes that they made were exact. He was comparing their versions to see if anybody's pulling a fast one on him, and they made exact changes. Everyone made the same changes in the same places. At any rate, so what's to be so terrible if the Goyim took the Torah? After all, God offered the Torah to all the Goyim before Jewish people. So if all the Goyim took the Torah, it would be wonderful. Everybody will live according to the law of God. So what's so terrible about that? That's not something that you should. But God, of course, understands, and unfortunately, it has been up to now. The nations will consistently, they won't observe the commandments of God. This is unfortunately the case up to the present day. It says, tigzul, don't steal, and unfortunately many of them still are, don't murder, and unfortunately many of them murdered. I'm not saying all of them, Baruch Hashem, but whatever it is, the fact is that it's not being followed. And unfortunately, because of that, God does not need His law to be treated with contempt, which is incidentally is the reason why we, as the Jews, have the responsibility in this emergency situation, and unfortunately it's been an emergency situation for thousands of years, to rise to it in the 119th Psalms. It's a time to do for the Lord. They are destroying His Torah. In other words, any time, especially when, unfortunately, there are times when others are not engaged in learning Torah and living according to the Torah, that puts the burden on those of us that are engaged in that activity to further our efforts in that direction.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because we wrote the Torah down, is that the reason why other religions were born out of it?
Not necessarily. No, we had to write it down because unfortunately the Jews were being more and more oppressed by Goyim, and we didn't have this capacity to retain all this knowledge. And our sages, they were just a superhuman effort that they were able to do it for these couple 2,000 years. So they had to write it down because they saw that the capacity of individuals was diminishing tremendously. And if they didn't write it down, God forbid, the whole Torah had been forgotten. So that's what they in fact did. Unfortunately not.
a superficial application of some of the laws, but they don't, since they don't accept the Torah path, the oral law, they don't apply it the way it's supposed to be applied. In other words, they use a concept written in the Psalm, yes.
Hold from mitzvahs, Yom Kippur. You don't see a goy, you don't see a goy. They just hold from what they call, they treat this as a second, even though they accept it, they treat it as a secondary thing. So they don't even hold it as anything important.
All right, so it says like this. So it says, Elo Mikra ani nosim lahem. I'll give you you write down the Mikra, the Chumash he wrote down. Shim Yobo, subjugate the Jews. You don't have, Jews will still be separated from them, and that's exactly what's happened up to the present day. The Jews that are faithful to Torah and mitzvahs are still separated from the Goyim, unfortunately. There will come a time when everybody will universally acknowledge God, and everybody will universally want to do the will of God, but that hasn't yet come. Yes?
Unfortunate that we're separated from the Goyim?
We're unfortunate that not everybody universally serving God would, according to His will.
But isn't it a good thing, since the Torah says that God separates us from the Goyim, that this is being fulfilled and that we're not, that we don't...
At this point, but that does not necessarily mean, I mean, every human being is created in Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Everybody has intelligence, and each one of them have a neshama, a soul, and they all are fit to go to heaven if they are righteous. And we have, in our halacha, is that a person need not be a Jew at all his life, if he is a righteous
What
Jew.
about this separation, though? There is supposed to be separation.
Yes, in order for us to come to holiness, if in the beginning of Kedoshim, Rashi explains that Perisha comes to Kedusha. You have to, in order to come to holiness, you have to separate yourself from the ordinary person. You cannot do what everybody else is doing. You must be faithful to the standards of conduct that the Torah is laying out for us, which is a very high standard indeed. We require us to control our passions in deference to the will of God. And this is a very difficult process, and that's the reason we have to learn the Gemara, poskim, the decision-making, and everything come to it. All right, now, any other questions? All mankind that will recognize the sovereignty of Almighty God, which is the proper thing to do, because after all, God is the master of the world. Yes?
Does God expect us to make the Goyim into righteous people?
God expects us first to make ourselves right.
Yeah.
Perhaps the power of example, but the ultimate sanctification in the name of God is that every human being should serve God in the proper fashion.
But is that an obligation upon the Jewish people specifically?
No.
It's an obligation upon us to show a proper example.
But that's all.
Well, no, not only that,
That's enough.
we must understand that all mankind is tied together. And if we show a proper example, it would be a proper thing for...
I understand, but the way God talked to them about receiving the Torah, they talked to God Almighty, and they still said, we don't want to accept the Torah.
Sometimes people will change their mind.
There's still a possibility for going to change too, even today.
They're talking to God and they wouldn't change their mind. I can't see how a human being can do it.
They have the potential.
Well, we have potential to, everybody has, as long as you're
But
alive.
is that our job to make them into something? Or
Our job to make us righteous.
I understand
that.
That's the
but
main
I'm
thing.
wondering,
We still got a little way to go.
can you have obligation upon the Jews to make the Goyim righteous?
No.
Let's put it like this. Let's put it like this.
It's not my job.
At this point, by way of example, we will show the world how to live.
Okay.
If you live according to the Torah, you become a very decent type.
We're not responsible if they're not righteous.
Yes, well, in a way we have.
In a sense, since they are created in the image of God, we are responsible to lead them in the proper direction.
If we do all we can do.
If we, you're supposed to do, we are all supposed to do, to the utmost of our capacity to become knowledgeable in Torah and mitzvahs and live according to Torah. And one of the things that we're supposed to do is not to show an improper example and to show a proper example.
Is it Chil Hashem for Jewish example?
Absolutely. It's a profaning of God's name for us not to live up to what we're potentially supposed to be, an Am Kodesh, a holy nation. To be holy is little more than just touching the basics. Yeah, no, holy means a real attempt. So that this article by Rabbi Dr. Samuel A. Turk of Codes and Responsa in the January 10th, 86 Jewish Press edition on page 27 continues. He says the Talmud is a vast sea of he's got big hard words.
Yes,
Suffice to say,
break it down for us.
I'll call it down to your, we'll go here. The Rambam, in his code, in his Mishnah Torah, offers a similar explanation. I'll quote. He quotes now the Rambam's introduction to his work. Quotes. The Rabbi Turk is quoting the Rambam. In our time, the persecutions increased greatly. The Rambam, of course, lived during the 1100s. He was born in Cordova, Spain in 1135. He was educated in northern Africa. The Rimagash was one of his Rabbonim, and the Rimagash, the Rabbi was Rav Alphus. Rav Alphus had a big yeshiva in Spain, and he wrote a book of codes that we accept him as a very great authority. He was so great that he wanted to include his codification in the Talmud, but his contemporary giants of Torah would not permit that because he lived 5 centuries after the Talmud closed up. At any rate, it was the Rambam. The Rambam was educated in northern Africa, and he ended up as the chief rabbi of Egypt, and he lived to about 1204, 1206. At any rate, he said this is the introduction to the code. In quotes, in our times, the Rambam, in our times the persecutions increased greatly. Times are extremely difficult for all. The wisdom of scholars has waned. A chief rabbi of Egypt. Therefore, those commentaries, laws, and responses which the Gaonim have written and which they have considered as most clarifying are rather blurred in our time, and only a few understand them properly at all. Needless to say that even less clear are the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud, the Sifrot. These require wide knowledge, much erudition, and much time in order to know the proper path concerning the forbidden and permissible matters and all the laws of the Torah. For this reason, I, Moses, the son of Maimon, the Sephardi, girded my loins, and with reliance upon God, blessed be He, and with my understanding of all these books, has seen fit to extract from all these volumes things that are clear regarding what is permitted and what is prohibited, what is pure and impure, together with all the rest of the laws of the Torah. I did this in precise language and in a succinct, so that the oral law will be formulated for all without discussions involving questions and answers, without one saying one thing and the other opposing it. If you learn the Torah, the Gemara, you'll get there, everybody's arguing with everybody else. You feel right at home. It's just, things will be clear according to the law, which has been clarified from all the books and commentaries that have been written from Rabbi Yehuda, the Holy One, that's Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, that set up the Mishnayos, until there would be a period of approximately almost 1,000 years. All the laws will be clear both to the small and the great in regard to every mitzvah and regarding all the things that the prophets and the scholars ordained. You see, the Rambam wrote this as a summary for the ordinary Jew to understand. Nowadays, if a scholar can explain successfully a little part of the Rambam, he's considered a great genius in the capacity to learn Torah. So you see.
Mean if a person can now Torah and
And understand it. Instead of a big genius in these things. Yes. Yeah. These are all commentaries, parts of the Torah Shema Al-Peh, the oral. These are compilations of commentaries. The sum of it all is that no one will need to resort to any other book in the world regarding Jewish law. This is the Rambam, according to Rambam. The sum of it all is that no one will need to resort to any other book in the world regarding Jewish law. This book has gathered together all of the oral law with the special rabbinical decrees, customs, and edicts which were made at the time of Moses our teacher until the composition of the Talmud, and as it was explained by the Gaonim in their volumes they wrote thereafter. Therefore I call this book Mishnah Torah. For when a man reads the written Torah, and then reads this, he will know from it the entire oral Torah, and will not have to read any other book between them. The Maimonides, Michael.
Where did they decide that it was okay to write it down?
At the time when the last of the prophets, they realized that the capacity to understand was diminishing to a point that it would be, God forbid, the Torah be forgotten.
But God had said,
I know that. We had to do something in order to save the Torah for the Jews. Otherwise the Torah would be forgotten. This is an emergency situation.
so can men take that upon themselves?
Not just men. We were talking about the greatest of them all. The greatest of them all, the men of the great assembly. They were among them were many prophets. So they communicated with with God, and they decided this was supposed to be. It had to be, otherwise we'd forget it. The proof of the pudding is that, unfortunately, in our time and age, it's a big deal. A person is Boki and Shas. That means he knows all the Talmud. And those times, they knew it all by heart.
Usually it's a big deal. Somebody doesn't even learn anything.
You learn a lot tomorrow.
You're already a big...
So I want you to understand that don't be so solicitous. We have to sometimes, in an emergency situation, do something. For instance, B'keach Nefesh. If you have to save a Jewish life, you may Machal Shabbos. You may do a lot of other Averas. But they're actually sin, they're not Averas, they're a mitzvah. You can save, we're trying to save the Yiddish and the Jewish Torah. This was an emergency. It's not something that we would take lightly.
I understand.
If we had the capacity of the earlier generation, there would be no necessity for it. But I certainly don't have that capacity. I'm sure that all around here do. The company accepted, of course. I'm sure that you can retain all that knowledge, but I don't have it. All right. Now, going back to the article, Rabbi Dr. Samuel A. Turk called the responsa. No sooner was the ink dry on the words the Maimonides had written when Rabbi Ibn Dawud, he's known by his Rosh Tevis,
He got after him.
attacked him in the following manner. The Rabbi is talking about himself. He sought to improve, he's talking about the Rambam, but did not improve. He left the path of all the former authors before him, because the Rambam was doing something revolutionary. Instead of quoting
Where he got the
where he's got his halacha,
He didn't quote Torah.
He didn't quote the person.
he just quoted the decision. Oh, I'll explain to you the shuk that halacha is usually not like the Rambam, it's like the Balaturi, because it quotes many sources. It is a lot of he doesn't, but a lot he does. I can give you an example of where he does, but first things first. We may need more than one session to do this. Perhaps next Sunday we'll continue with this thing. I don't want to leave it in limbo, but we'll go as far as we can today. I want you to know that there will be a continuation of this subject, yes.
Rashi.
We're talking about a code of law.
Law.
He'll explain here, and this is why I'm quoting this article, so you'll get some understanding why this approach of the Rambam was not accepted by the rabbis, and why it was.
By Turk. He says like this, quoting the Rabbi. The Rambam, he left the path of all the former authors before him, the Rambam did. They brought evidence, they wrote things and gave the names of those who said them. This procedure had great value. Sometimes a judge, now listen very carefully, may have in mind to permit or prohibit something, and his evidence comes from one source. If he would know that someone greater than he does not agree with his decision, he may change his mind. Now, I do not know why I should retract from my decision and my evidence because of the book that Maimonides, wrote. In other words, it's hidden. A lot of times the situation, on the side, a lot of times the situation arises that doesn't follow the ordinary course of events, and you have to decide a question of halacha, not necessarily according to the ordinary case. There will be an extraordinary situation, and you have to have sources other than the ordinary case that would take care of an extraordinary situation. Like I explained to you there by B'keach Nefesh, ordinarily a Jew is not permitted to machal Shabbos. Ordinarily a Jew is not permitted to violate the Sabbath. But if it's the case to save a Jewish life, it is considered a mitzvah, an obligation of a Jew to violate the Shabbos. So there again, you can't just make just a rule of law without exceptions to take care of different situations as they develop. Furthermore, there are matters in which the Kohanim disagree. And this author, Maimonides, selected the words of one and wrote them in his book. Why should I rely on his choice if it does not appeal to me, since I do not know the words of the one who disagrees, if they are valid or not?
So this is, he's not talking about the Gemara. He's talking about the Gedolim that came before the Rambam.
Yeah.
And the Rambam does the Reef.
Yeah.
He may choose another Rishon or another Gon instead of the Reef.
Yeah.
But he doesn't tell you what the Reef said.
He
doesn't.
doesn't.
The one point of
That's
view.
the reason why the Rambam's Mishnah Torah was frowned upon by the Gedolim in that generation. You understand? And it's come to the present day. This is only to accept the decision of one who is haughty. Well, that I don't. That's the Rabbi saying. I'm not saying it. Introduction to Mishnah Torah. Rabbi even thou difference in hundreds of places with Maimonides' conclusion and shows that his criticisms of the code were justified. This is the Rabbi Turk. Of course, this is Rabbi Turk saying that. Then comes later on, later on, 3 centuries, Rabbi Kiro, and he explains what appears to be differences between the Rabbi and the Rambam, and they can be explained that the Rabbi is not understanding what the Rambam is saying in many cases. But at any rate, so he goes here. Now Rabbi Turk is explaining why the rule of law is not usually like the Rambam. Moshe, please. If you have a question or comment, please.
No, it's all right.
One does not necessarily come to the definitive decision of the law from the Talmudic source. Codes arrive at different conclusions and decisions from the same Talmudic source. And codes of law written succinctly, yeah, are not comprehensive enough to cover all possible varying situations, like I explained to you. Their formulations are meant for the average case, not all the cases average. Furthermore, the codifier usually rules in accordance with the more stringent opinion. Now, sometimes a stringent opinion is not appropriate for this particular type of case. Only one who is familiar with Talmudic sources, a source knows the law for the exceptional and unusual cases and can render a proper ruling. Now, this is fundamental. This is the reason we have to learn Gemara. That's why you can't paskin halacha just looking in the Rambam. There's no way in the world that you can paskin because he's only one source of many. You have to understand where he's coming from and everything. In the case of the Balaturim, they start out with three giants in Torah in the beginning. The Balaturim, his father, Rabbi Osher, and his fellow Talmud, Rabbi Yerucham. These old three giants usually pass in the same way. So we start out with 3 against 1 in the Rambam, so usually the halacha is like them when they disagree with the Rambam. Knowing the leading opinion, by studying the source, one may sometimes rule in accordance with it in an exceptional or unusual situation. And this is what's necessary. Sometimes a person comes and needs a heter. He needs a permissive situation where ordinarily it's not usually ruled that way. But if it's an emergency situation or some permissive type, there is a necessity for it. And there are some of the reasons why not all scholars were enthusiastic about Ma'abanita's code, even though they recognized some of its benefits and admired the stupendous effort and genius it represented. See, we're not putting down the Rambam. To write a Mishnah Torah, you had to be a Rambam. You just couldn't be any ordinary scholar. No question about it. It represented a tremendous thing, but it was not to be equated the same as the only authority. Also, the great rabbis were very much afraid that the codes would be reduced to the study of the Talmud, which they felt would be a step in the wrong direction. Because the Talmud, Baruch Hashem, discusses it thoroughly. You have all kinds of opinions on all kinds of situations. And so if sometimes one thing doesn't apply, then another thing doesn't apply. We had a case like that we learned a couple of months ago, and relates to Hilchos Chanukah. About, you recall, in the Gemara in Shabbos? We learned there in Shabbos there that, I'll quote it to you just a little bit, if you don't mind. Is this Shabbos? Wait. That's why I say it'll take more than one session, even just touch the basis. I'm not trying to do because it says like this. I said like this. Torah Rabbanon, our rabbis learned. This is the Gemara in Shabbos and the Talmud Bavli on Chof Aleph Amud Beis, and 21st folio on the second side. Our rabbis learned mitzvahs Chanukah Mir Ish Ubeso. The important mitzvah Chanukah is that you should have one candle lit by one person for the entire household. That is the Iker mitzvah of lighting candles on the 8 nights of Hanukkah. So once you know that this is the Iker mitzvah, we're accustomed, Baruch Hashem, everybody lights his own candles all the way up to 8 and everything. But it's good to know that in Sefer you didn't have that many candles. You only had one. You'd say, what's the use of lighting one if today I have till 6? The truth is that the halacha provides for that. If you light one, you're fulfilling the mitzvah.
Like Erev Shabbos?
Whatever day. In case for some reason you're boxed out. Although we don't ordinarily paskin that way. But if you have an emergency situation, you fulfill the mitzvah. Don't think that you're not doing it, you're not touching it. You get it? It's a very important thing to know that thing. All right. So he steps out with this thing. Then he goes on to further. A mahadrin, a person that's zealous and really wants to do it, he does a little better than that. What does that do? Everybody in the family lights just one candle every night. Again, this is mahadrin. That's even better than the ordinary case, than the ordinary rule of law requires. Again, you don't know anybody just lights one candle every night. We're not even accustomed to do it. But it's good to know that there is such an opinion, right? Then you go on to further. And then it says, I'm a hadron. You've heard that phrase a billion times. The ones that are most serious of zillions, the ones really up there. Cool. Then there's a dispute. Beis Shammai says, Yom Rishon Mono, on the first day you light 8 candles, Mikan Milo, and further on, going into the Yom Tov, it gets less, going further, until you come into the last day, you light only 1 candle. And what the Beis Hillel says, Yom Rishon Madlik, and that's the halacha. You light a 1, you go add, and you go further, take up to 8, like we do. Okay? If a person just looks and says, this is the halacha, if he sees somebody lighting 1 candle and says, you don't know what you're doing. You're not even fulfilling the mitzvah. You're making a bracha. Nothing can be further from the truth. He's not making a bracha Torah. He's fulfilling the mitzvah. This other guy is ignorant. He doesn't know. And this is the way it is all over in the Gemara. Don't make the assumption because somebody's doing it a little different than you're doing it, or even with Psak Halacha is, because we want to do it the best way possible, obviously, that necessarily means he's not fulfilling the mitzvah. You understand? Did I give you an example? Okay. Yes.
is it not true that when the Ramah usually quotes a source, he quotes one way of doing, he quotes one way. He doesn't tell you there's 5 different opinions to this. Don't the poskim usually tell you their one way of doing it?
Oh, but you misunderstand. Don't misunderstand. The Rambam is giving an entire code. That means he is theoretically, or truthfully, is not. But to the ordinary average Jew that would not be a scholar, would not recognize this fact, they would think this is it. Anything other than this would not be fulfilling the mitzvah.
That's the way he puts it in there. He
Yeah.
says this is all you need.
That's what I mean. So that thing that they fought. The great rabbis fought this because they felt that this was Ramah is only giving the minhagim of the Ashkenaz Jews. That's what he's doing. The ones that we're annoying.
In fact, you could put, he gets that from the Darkei Moshe, which is in effect, isn't that actually a volume in itself, which is just...
That's right, he wrote it too, Darkei Moshe too.
It's a column in itself, but we have it inside the Balaturim. It could have been put as a book, as a regular volume.
But he was only taking one point of view because he wanted to talk about the minhagim. He's just adding on to what he was not intending to give a broad thing. He just tried one.
You know, but what I'm saying, the Shulchan Aruch himself, he doesn't go and quote and say, oh, this is said this. He gives his psak halacha. He doesn't, from what I've learned, he doesn't go and tell all the sources that were previous to him, and he doesn't go say...
We have nowadays, Baruch Hashem, in this Shulchan Aruch, we have printed the sources. You can find the sources. But the Rambam's book, the Mishnah Torah, is great, and without question, it's tremendous. No shayla about it. It still represented this difficulty, and therefore we had to avoid it. All right, let's go further. The publication of law actually defeated its purpose. This is what Rabbi Turk says. The code gave rise to numerous commentaries which sought to eliminate even Diode's criticism, the Ravid's criticisms. Some commentators sought mainly to supply the Talmudic sources from which the Maimonides drew his conclusions. That's the Beis Yosef. He in the Kesef Mishnah, he wrote that. He tried to explain where Rambam got his sources. Others sought to defend his conclusion from the attacks which were leveled against him. He also did some of that too. Thus, it sometimes may be a shorter process to go through the Talmudic source than to plow through most or all of the commentators on Maimonides' code, because they lead you in the wrong direction. You first have to defend this one opinion, when in fact, if you go to the Talmudic sources, you got all the opinions there. And of course, there's a rule of ordinary law and everything, but then you have to go to the old. Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be pestering, but
No.
the thing is, see, tell me if I'm wrong. The Gemara gives you 4 or 5 different opinions. Still, there's some opinions that are so way out we would never consider. The Rambam is giving you the status quo opinion.
He's giving the ordinary case.
Why is the Rabbi saying you don't have to go to Torah? You can the prosecutor that.
No, there again, he may be more severe than he should have been. Maybe in his enthusiasm to affect the situation, he was attacking it in that fashion. But we will go, Friedlander, next week Sunday. We will go into some of the commentaries, and we will see, in fact, that what I've been discussing with you now is a fact to dig. For instance, you have the Chumash in front of you. I'll quote one source from the Rashi in the Chumash. If you look at the beginning of Bahar, in Vayikra, actually I can start 2 places. B'chukosai. First look at B'chukosai, Vayikra. B'chukosai, that would be chapter, that's page 178 in the Rashi, Chumash with Rashi. 178 in Vayikra, 3rd book of the Chumash. And that would be the end of chapter 26, verse 46. You have it?
Yep.
Yes. Before Rabbi Shishi.
Torahs asher nasan Hashem ve'eno uvein b'nei Yad Moshe.
These are the statutes, the things that we can't ordinarily understand. Only God understands them. And that's the ordinances that people could many times understand. But Torahs, the language, is a plural form of the word Torah. More than one. God gave us 2 Torahs. That God gave between himself and between the children of Israel on Mount Sinai through the hand of Moshe. If you look in Rashi, 2nd column, 3 lines from the bottom. What does it say? Torahs? Achas v'ksav, one was written,
the Achas B'Alpeh, and one was by mouth. The Magi teaches, relates to us. Shekulam Nosan L'Mai. All of it was given to Moshe from Sinai. Will anybody come to you and tell you that the Talmudic literature was not given by God? It was given by God. Now, another source. Beginning of Bahar, just 169. The beginning of Bahar, page 169, chapter Chof Hei, Posik in Vayikra. All right, read that. You have it? Page 169? The first Posik, way about it. All right, that's it. God spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai saying, and he was talking now there about the mitzvahs, the 7th year. So look at Rashi, Bahar Sinai. What is the subject matter of Shemitah, the 7th year, have relevance to Mount Sinai? Were not all the commandments said at Sinai? Elamah Shemitah, but just like Shemitah, the laws of Shemitah, Namru Prolosel was said with all its generalizations, or Protosel, and all its specifics and its minute details. Misinai of Kulam. So also all the other mitzvahs, Namru were said, Koloseim, their generalization, Nikukim, and their minute details, Misinai, Torahs Kohanim. In Torahs Kohanim, this is the explanation given. In other words, when early, well, that's it. So you should understand that the Torah about Kesab, written Torah is the clothes, the generalizations. And Torah Shabbat is the specifics. Well, I'll give you other examples of that Sunday, Friedlander, next Sunday. As Hashem, we will continue this year with this subject matter. All right, you stop at that point. Okay. We are continuing this year with what I was discussing last Sunday in regards to the explanation of the Torah Shabbat, Sav and Torah Shabbat Peh. You should understand that the time the Rabbi Shem gave it, he gave it them in two parts. The written Torah and the oral Torah was given by word of mouth. That's why it's called Torah Shabbat Peh, by mouth. And the written Torah was given by written down, the Chumash, and later on the Tanakh, the Nevi'im and Kesuvim. We have learned in Medrash Rabbah on Mem Zayin, in the beginning of that, God did not want that the Torah Shabbat Peh should not be written down. I've run across a Medrash Tanchuma discusses the same point, and there the Medrash is a little more explicit as to the reasoning as to why God did not want the Torah Shabbat Peh written down. Later, of course, it was written down, and we have the Talmudic literature as a result of that. But at the time that God gave it through Moshe Rabbeinu, it was not written down. And this is found in Parshas Kisisa, in Medrash Tanchuma, Sifra, the 34th verse. It says, Moshe, God said to Moshe, write you these words. And he quotes from Hosea, the same that the Medrash Rabbah quotes. He says, if I write him the majority of my Torah, Kamo Zar Nichoshku, we considered like a stranger. Moshe, for yourself. Because Moshe also wanted the explanation, the Torah Shabbat Peh be written down, not only the Torah Shabbat of the Ksavs. But because God foresaw almost all of the nations of the world, Sidim Lahargom, Latargom as a Torah, they would in the future translate the Torah that was written down. The Yos Korin about Yavonis, and we written down in Greek, as the Ptolemy translation was written down. And this is what God was trying to put. The Heim Omrim, they would say, we the Goyim are Yisrael. So in order to prevent this fraud, that they claim that they're Yisrael and not the Bnei Yisrael, God says, the Holy One, blessed be He, to the Goyim. Tem Omrim, you say, God, Tem Ben Bonai, you are my children. We're not saying that nobody, every person is not the child of God. we're saying the chosen child, a child of God, to go and observe His Torah. Any idea, only the one that I have handed over to him, my special translation of it. This was the writing, the learning that was given by Al-Peh. And everything from it is explained. In other words, the Mishnah was not written down, and the Gemara and everything else. There would be this possibility, and God wanted to avoid this possibility. But as the time came by, the Jews had been persecuted from the word go, and finally the Romans had conquered the Jewish nation, and they took over political dominion of the Jews, and they were scattering them over the world. So, to understand the situation, I will read to you the preface written to the Torah Tamima by Rabbi, who was the son of the Aruch HaShulchan. Rabbi Levi Epstein lived from 1860 to 1940. His father wrote the great Parish, the Aruch HaShulchan. It's a commentary that we accept as authoritative, ad hayom at the present day. Commentary in the Shulchan.
Yeah, but this is the latest one, isn't it?
Yeah, the Aruch HaShulchan, the Baal Aruch HaShulchan died in 1906. It was written after the Mishnah Berurah.
Yeah.
Although the Baal Mishra Chavetz Chaim lived to 1933. Yes, but he wrote his Sefer after the Mishnah Berurah wrote his Sefer. Mishnah Berurah wrote his Sefer in the 1800s. He wrote his...
Oh, that is...
Yeah, well, no, yeah, but there are others later than him, of course. But now, the Torah, Baruch HaLevi Epstein wrote this parish, Torah Tamima, the complete Torah, wherein he combined the Torah Shabbat, the written Torah, with Torah Shabbat, with the oral Torah. He went through the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, the Sifra, which is also called Torah's Kohanim, the Sifri, the Tosefta, Mechilta, all the commentaries on the Talmud, and also other Horshim. And he wrote his Torah Tamimo. He wrote it when he was a relatively young man. He was born in, 1860, and he wrote it. He was about 29 years old when he wrote the book. Now this is his preface. I'll try to say as faithfully as I can to the original. So this particular book is being written. This is a book of the Torah of God, His commandments, His statutes, and His ordinances, that was given to us from Sinai. But at that time was given just with generalizations, and the most important points and the foundations was given to us. To say to us, these generalizations, these important points, and the foundations of all the mitzvahs, and all the statutes and all the ordinances. And this, Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher, wrote it down from the mouth dictation of God, Holy One blessed be He, and he wrote it and he gave it to all Israel. But its specifics and its branches and its clarifications with its explanations, and they are very much deep, and they have to go to great minute detail, and all the learnings that you clarify from it, the deep understanding that you have to go and get into it, to understand it extraordinarily well, and to understand it in a very broad fashion. This was handed by word of mouth. From God to Moshe Rabbeinu by word of mouth. In order he should teach them one that's fitting to learn them. Not everybody is capable of learning Torah Shabbat, the oral Torah, because it's so deep and it requires constant thinking. To understand it to one who is fit to understand it. And this we have received our tradition. And he doesn't say where he quotes it from, but it is a Gemara in Brachas. He says, I'll give to you the tablets of stone, the Torah and the mitzvahs, the written Torah, the mitzvah